Ronald E. Bartholomew received a bachelor and master's degree from BYU and a doctorate in the sociology of education from the University of Buckingham in London, England. He has published scholarly articles in academic journals in the United States and Europe, and has written several chapters in various published volumes. His research interests include 19th century missionary work in Victorian England, non-urban areas, as well as assorted topics in ancient scripture and church history. He is a faculty member at the Orem University LDS Institute of Religion, adjacent to Utah Valley University, and is adjunct faculty at Brigham Young University, Provo, Salt Lake, and Idaho. Presenting on the topic entitled Church Membership in the British Press, I give you my personal friend, Ron Bartholomew.
Roger, actually, I believe that's the topic for the next speaker. But I am going to, that's fine. I'm going to talk about immigration and church growth in County Durham. So, if you'll just give me a second to pull this up.
That's not even the one here. Church Membership in the British Press, Ronald Bartholomew.
Yeah, they gave you the wrong thing. I'm so sorry that they did that to you. All right. Okay. All right. This isn't working, but we're going to try one more time, and if we can't get to work, we're just going to go ahead. There we go. No, I've got it. It just worked.
Well, Bartholomew has so many topics, it's amazing that he knows what he's doing today.
Okay. Immigration and church growth in County Durham, 1884 to 1930. Here we go. In 1924, Elder James E. Talmage, president of the European Mission, succinctly summarized the irreconcilable condition in which many European Latter-day Saints found themselves. A desire to emigrate, but the inability to do so for economic reasons. He said, "It is natural that those who join the church in England or other countries foreign to the United States should wish to gather with their fellow religionists. And if they have the money requisite to the journey and to the establishment of the new homes in the West, they do so. But those so able are relatively few. Despite these economic difficulties, members continue to find ways to immigrate. As a result, the church membership in England experienced a steady decline throughout the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, at least partially due to the slow but steady flow of immigration, even in the face of insufficient resources of the Perpetual Immigration Fund and the general destitute condition of nearly all the saints. An additional explanation for overall decline in church membership during this time period was given by Bruce C. Van Orden, who noted that throughout England, the overall growth of the church was in decline by the 1870s due to the effects of the religious persecution associated with the anti-polygamy campaigns, alleged problems in Utah, and perhaps most of all, the general apathy and lack of religious fervor in England. Interestingly and significantly, church membership in County Durham experienced opposite growth trends during the same time period, despite the existence of these same conditions and influences. The purpose of this paper is to explore possible explanations for this variance. I will argue that in addition to the population increase incident to the industrialization experienced in County Durham throughout this time period of 1884 to 1930, there were other factors influencing church growth in this county which not only exceeded the rate of population growth from 1884 to 1913, but was the opposite of the general decline in membership growth experienced elsewhere in the British Mission during the same time period. Additionally, I will assert that the rate of Latter-day Saint immigration from this county was lower than the British Mission prior to the outbreak of World War I in 1914, primarily due to the economic boom conditions, and in contradistinction, higher than the British Mission after 1914 because of the dire economic bust. It is interesting to compare church growth before and after the existence of the Durham Conference, with 1884 representing the beginning of a second phase with consolidation in the Newcastle Conference. Church growth, see Table 1, for the time period 1856 to 1883, the duration of the Durham Conference shows a significant increase in convert baptisms both numerically and by percentage when compared with the British mission. While the numbers of total convert baptisms in the British mission is declining during these years, it is increasing in County Durham. Despite this, Table 2 reveals that the number of convert baptisms is still a very small percentage, less than 2% of the total British mission. One of the purposes of this paper is to investigate whether or not that same upward trend continued beyond 1884, the year the Durham Conference was assimilated into the Newcastle Conference. Through 1930, the date most branches ceased keeping records of convert baptisms, or at least those records are no longer extant. Table 3 indicates that this upward trend did in fact continue. Church growth rates in County Durham remained relatively constant through 1891, despite the fact that the British mission growth experienced an overall decline during the same time period. Baptism rates in County Durham and the British mission both increased during the years of 1892 to 1911, but the growth rates were more than twice as great in County Durham. After 1911, both the British mission and County Durham experienced a steady decline, but church membership was still greater in County Durham. It is significant that incident to the increase of the numbers of convert baptisms, the percentage of convert baptisms in County Durham, in contrast to the British mission, grew from 1.5% during the years 1856 to 1883 to 7% during the time period of 1884 to 1930, as shown in this table. Likewise, it also dramatically exceeded population growth during the boom years prior to the outbreak of World War I, but declined sharply when compared to the population growth from 1914 to 1930. The data presented in Table 5, shown here, strongly suggests that church growth rates cannot be adequately explained by population growth rates. What has not been previously considered is the relationship between immigration and church growth in this county. As can be seen in Table 6, immigration rates in comparison to convert baptisms were lower than elsewhere in the British mission prior to the outbreak of World War I, but higher afterwards. From this data, we can identify that at least one possible explanation for a steady increase in church membership prior to World War I, i.e., the fact that immigration rates were lower in County Durham than elsewhere in the British mission. Similarly, immigration rates which are significantly higher after the outbreak of World War I can at least partially explain the decline in church membership in County Durham during the years 1914 to 1930. What local factors relative to the LDS Church in County Durham during the years 1884 to 1930 can be proffered as possible explanations for the above average baptismal rates, accompanied by lower immigration rates during the pre-war years and lower baptismal rates, to the contradistinction of higher immigration rates after the outbreak of the Great War? From 1843, when the church was first established in County Durham, to 1913, the year coal production reached its zenith, the residents of County Durham were living on the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. Neighboring Newcastle upon Tyne had previously been the country's most important coal exporting center, but during this period, the majority of the nation's coal originated from County Durham, and thus, the importance of the proliferation of collieries as Durham's primary industry cannot be overstated. However, County Durham also included other important industries, such as the lead and iron works that dotted the countryside. In addition, Sunderland had become the world's largest shipbuilding center, as such the most important in the county and the country, with additional shipbuilding centers in Tyneside, Teesside, and Hartlepool. It was in this socio-economic context that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was first introduced and then flourished in County Durham. These various industries and innovations attracted money and labor. This, in turn, led to a veritable population explosion. County Durham grew from a rural area dotted with small villages to an important industrial center, with the population expanding from 253,910 in 1831 to 1,369,860 by 1911, with most of the growth being attributed to the need for labor and the availability of jobs in the expanding colliery industry. The exploitation of coal transformed the county's landscape, giving rise to numerous pit villages, with the number of total villages more than doubling, as well as the vast expansion of existing villages and towns. However, this explosive growth was also a socio-economic paradox. As Boehnen and Ostrin have correctly observed, quote, mining was an industry centrally involved in capitalist expansion. In that sense, it was clearly part of the modern world. However, with its expansion, so too did traditional relationships of power and authority maintain themselves. In fact, the very nature of the coal mining industry allowed for the strengthening of the position of the landowning class within the county. Rural and industrial elements were held together as the old ruling class regulated the emerging capitalist economy. Therefore, on the Durham coalfield, county society with its institutions remained intact as coal production increased. In contrast to the urbanization that occurred in the cotton towns, where masses of people migrated from the agricultural caste system dominated by the landed gentry and moved to the cities and factories, while discarding traditions of the past on multiple levels, County Durham experienced no such social revolution. The coal pits were inextricably connected to the landed gentry, the same families that owned both the land and the coal that was being taken from it. And so County Durham's own industrial revolution was simply a shift from one landed industry to another. Across the county, agriculture was simply replaced by coal, and rural villages became company towns. Instead of the industrial urban centers emerging throughout the countryside, the colliery population was as scattered as the coal pits. Another aspect of the socioeconomic condition of the Durham coalfield was the paternalism of the landowners. By 1913, nearly 49,000 tied colliery houses had been erected, housing more than 260,000 people, nearly one-fourth of the county's total population. Tied housing was not only tied to one's employment, but was also tied to marital status and years in service, with deference to those who were married with families based on years of marriage and service tenure. During the early stages of the development of the coal mines, the colliery row living conditions were deplorable. However, over time, the condition of the tied housing improved, and the mine owners eventually provided medical treatments, education, and other services for their pitmen and their families as long as they remained in their employ. This complex social construct not only retained some Mormon converts in the county, but because of opportunity and the need for labor, it also facilitated church growth during a time of mass immigration and declining success in missionary work throughout the rest of the mission through 1913. William F. Rigby, a missionary who served in County Durham during the boom years, observed that another reason prosperous conditions did not necessarily have a positive effect on immigration rates among many of the saints was primarily due to their inability to manage their improved conditions. He wrote, "I went and spent the afternoon with Brother and Sister Robert Middleton, who had been in the church for 38 years, but had been unwise when they had money to go to Utah with and spent it. Now he is old, and him and his wife are breaking down in health and are in the depths of poverty, and through drink and poverty have used means and that saints had placed in their hands and could not pay it back. Hence they have been cut off, and they have lost the confidence of the saints and are lost themselves almost. And they, like many more of their type, have through not obeying the servants of God and gathering with the saints when they could, are paying the penalty of disobedience to God's commandments." Elder Rigby noted elsewhere that this situation was all too common amongst the County Durham saints during the boom years. He notes, quote, "Found a family that had been in the church some 30 years and of the abject poverty they were in. Their name was Willits. He had been very active local elder in his time and had earned £5 a week for years. But he had drunk some, and his wife, being a poor manager, as where very many English women are, they had never gathered. Now he is 64 and only getting from 12 to 15p per week. And there is many that their day is past." County Durham's economy during the 19th and 20th century had been established on industries that were export dependent and had received stimulus leading up to the First World War. However, this left them highly vulnerable and disadvantaged when the industrialized world sank in depression in the 1920s, and especially during the interwar years of 1918 to 1939 in Great Britain. As a result, the steel, coal, lead, and shipbuilding industries in County Durham experienced sharp declines or wide fluctuations. Economists note that output fell by 25% between 1918 and 1921 and did not recover until the end of the Great Depression. Thus, the United Kingdom actually suffered a 20-year depression beginning in 1918. The counties of northern England, which include County Durham, bore the brunt of this depression. Shipbuilding, for example, a primary industry of County Durham, declined by 90%, with some towns experiencing unemployment rates up to 70%. The coal industry suffered the strikes of 1921 and 1926, which proved to be disastrous for the miners and their trade unions and resulted in longer hours, lower wages, and simultaneously allowed foreign competitors to capture exporting markets during these times of non-production. As a result, the number of people employed in the coal industry fell from 165,000 in 1913 to 128,000 by 1930. Pits were closed or put into mothballs. As a result, the miners, steel and lead workers, and shipbuilders of County Durham, who had experienced marked socioeconomic progress, especially during the Edwardian era, suffered some of the greatest socioeconomic losses in the United Kingdom and possibly the world during the interwar years following World War I. Interestingly and significantly, while this had a somewhat negative impact on convert baptisms, these economically depressed conditions rekindled a universal desire among the saints to emigrate, as noted earlier by then President of the British Mission, Elder Talmage. The fact that County Durham was one of the hardest areas hit by these depressed economic conditions provides at least one explanation for dramatically increased immigration rates from 1914 to 1930 in comparison with the British Mission. And this despite the fact that it would have been much more difficult to finance immigration. The prospects of gathering to Utah with the saints would have been perceived as that much better. Another aspect of the social, political, and economic milieu that is extremely interesting and important to this study is the fact that as a result of the Durham Mining Association becoming the most powerful and efficient trade union in Great Britain, the local miners acquired complete self-governance for the 40-year period of 1869 to 1908, electing their own local and national officials. Men elected to these offices typically grew up from the ranks of the local miners, and 100% of them were members of the Durham Miner Association, the Independent Labor Party, and were Methodists. The Methodist emphasis on self-discipline, which included refraining from alcohol, gambling, and other depredations, led to a self-educated, service-oriented cadre of local leaders who spoke and acted decisively. The influence of Methodism on the unions and their political policies, as well as the selection of their leadership, cannot be overstated. Most of these local and national elected officials were not only Methodists, they had also been or were concurrently during their terms of service Methodist preachers. In addition, these men were decidedly socialists, vehemently opposing the oppression of capitalism, making County Durham the first political district in the United Kingdom where the Labor Party won all the elections. These leaders celebrated the virtues of manual labor and despised the privileged position of land and mine owners. However, despite the fact that their focused and persistent efforts over a 40-year period resulted in numerous achievements, including improved working contracts, legislative controls placed on wages, a shortened work week and working hours, improved mining conditions, elected officers whose positions were protected by the government, eventual limited private property holdings, and the accompanying luxuries of discretional spending money and leisure time, all that were very unique in England at that time. The mines and most housing were still owned by the landed upper class. Consequently, Durham remained rural, even though the mining towns grew larger. However, the class struggles there were ever present. Most men worked in the collieries by day, but eventually were able to acquire large gardens or small farms where they raised livestock or poached game for wild game for food. This was seen as a measure of independence from the capitalist landowners. In addition, most colliery villages had cooperative stores, which operated similar to the cooperative movement of the Latter-day Saints in their Great Basin Kingdom. While these conditions were not anomalous to County Durham per se, they were accentuated because of the tensions existing between the capitalist landowners and self-governing socialist labor movement. In addition, Methodism was the vehicle for the upward social mobility of the laboring class in this county, and significantly, it has been empirically demonstrated that during the first century of its existence, more converts to Mormonism came from the Methodists than any other faith group. Therefore, in historical perspective, County Durham was center stage for the high drama associated with class struggle, social reform, and religious revivalism, a situation perfectly situated on multiple levels for LDS missionaries serving there during the years of 1884 to 1930. Interestingly, LDS missionaries serving in County Durham may have even perceived themselves and their message as part of the vehicle of progressive social and religious change. This coincided in part with the upheaval in the religious landscape of the time. In fact, as one historian asserted, quote, religion played an even more substantial role, unquote, in the Mormon phenomenon than the socio-economic changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Religion became vital in Great Britain, and active religion set the tone of society. This may have been accentuated in County Durham, where the influence of Methodism reached far beyond the pew into the innermost workings of the labor unions and subsequent government officials elected from their ranks. This nonconformist fervor was ignited into full flame by the Wesleyan revival, in which miners of the County Durham became completely immersed, and most other major denominations were also influenced by the new religious spirit and participated in organized crusades. They were joined by secular movements as well, such as the highly successful labor movement in County Durham. But as the Methodists and other nonconformist movements grew in the prosperity and respectability of their members, they became less attractive to the rank and file of the working class laborer. It was from this matrix that the Mormon missionaries in County Durham were able to find converts in greater numbers than elsewhere in Great Britain, despite the fact that their new religious movement clashed with existing religious and secular norms. For example, unlike the Christian clergymen, Mormon preachers were poor and humble, which endeared them to the poorer laboring class, miners, steel and lead workers, and shipbuilders, who as a group had become disenchanted with the formality and exclusivity of the middle and upper class conformists, and likewise with the increasing middle class nonconformist movements. Elder Joseph P. Walton, among others, capitalized on this when he said, quote, "After being introduced to the audience, I presented my claim upon them for a sympathetic support as a fellow countryman by blood and religion, a disciple of Christ. I asked them to consider me a humble man from the ranks of the commons without educational training or even an inclination to publicity." Despite the fact that their movement was particularly tailored to the time, the Latter-day Saint Church was still seen as an aberration in County Durham during this time period, clearly outside the social, cultural, and religious norm. As a result, the most frequent incidents relative to proselytizing reporting in the journals and histories of members and missionaries living in County Durham during this time period were in reference to persecution. This persecution ranged from missionaries simply being dismissed or ignored in their attempts to proselytize to the mob attacks of 1912 that eventually led to the murder of Elder Ralph H. Hendricks in Sunderland in February of 1913. Despite the fact that missionaries and their message were particularly well suited for this time and place, Latter-day Saints were self-proclaimed deviants from accepted religious tradition and were exclusive and polemic in their relationships with other Christian organizations. They welcomed disaffected members of other religious traditions, and they embraced the millennial and restorationist theological positions prevalent among some of the new religions of the time. Despite these tensions, there were undoubtedly many converts who joined this or other new religious movements in an effort to intentionally separate themselves from the culture and secular norm. In this light, it is interesting to note that several studies have shown that many Mormon converts were in their 20s or early 30s and unmarried. This suggests that they may have been inclined to accept a new religion and even a new citizenship, being unrestrained by the ties of marriage or a settled life. Studies also indicate that many of them were former members of the Methodist or Baptist splinter groups and were ready for and receptive to change. In conclusion, as seen in the data presented, the economic boom years of 1884 to 1913 correlate with baptismal rates that dramatically exceeded those elsewhere in the British mission. This is best explained by the population explosion incident to the industrial boom of 1884 to 1913, which brought a mobile population into County Durham that was ready for economic, social, and apparently religious change as well. The influence of trade unionism, Methodism, and self-governance thrust County Durham onto center stage for the high drama associated with class struggle, social reform, and religious revivalism, a situation perfectly suited on multiple levels for the Latter-day Saint missionaries and their message, and this despite the churches existing on the outside of social and cultural norms. Incident to the socio-economic paradox of prosperity and paternalism of the landowners, converts were apparently content to remain in a better than average economy. This is evidenced by the fact that during that time period there were likely more people able to emigrate because of fiscal good fortune, who either chose not to or were unable to because of mismanagement when compared with the British mission average. Conversely, the economic bust of 1914 to 1930 correlated directly with lower baptismal rates. This was a dark time, representing not only a slump in the economy, but also in religiosity. Significantly, however, during the time when less converts would likely have had the resources to immigrate, rates were actually higher in County Durham than the British mission. This would point to the idea that in a depressed economy, the call to gather with the saints in Utah may have become that much more attractive. Thank you.